The sky over Dobodura, New Guinea is not the majestic blue of a postcard. It is a shimmering, oppressive haze of heat and humidity that tastes of salt, aviation fuel, and impending death. High above the jagged emerald green peaks of the Owen Stanley Range, Lieutenant Robert Hayes is trapped in a nightmare of physics. His P-38 Lightning, a twin-tailed beast of silver and fire, is screaming. He slams the control yoke to the left, desperate to roll away from the white-gray shadow of a Mitsubishi Zero that has been glued to his six for 3 agonizing minutes. But as he moves the stick, something terrifying happens. Or rather, nothing happens. For a fraction of a heartbeat, the plane remains level, sluggish, as if it's thinking about the command before deciding to obey. That split second of slop in the controls is all the Japanese pilot needs. The Zero cuts inside the Lightning's wide, lumbering turn, its 20mm cannons sparking against the clouds. Tracers zip past Hayes' canopy like angry fireflies. He is flying one of the most advanced machines in the American arsenal, yet he feels like he's trying to steer a sinking ship with a broken rudder. He knows that back at the base, the manuals say his plane is within specifications, but up here, in the thin air where life meets the abyss, those specifications are a death sentence. He is sweating, not just from the tropical heat, but from the realization that his machine has a ghost in its nervous system. Every time he tries to maneuver, there is a delay, a deadly pause that allows the enemy to close the distance. The Zero pilot is an artist of the air, and Hayes is merely his canvas. The Japanese plane dances, its movements fluid and instantaneous. Hayes pulls a high G turn, his vision tunneling into blackness, but the P-38 responds with the grace of a freight train. He can hear the metal groaning, the cables stretching, and he knows that the next time he tries to roll, the lag might be his last. How can a machine built to dominate the skies be defeated by a few inches of loose cable? What happens when the engineers in California are thousands of miles away from the reality of a cockpit filled with the smell of ozone and fear? To understand how a pilot like Robert Hayes found himself at the mercy of a superior enemy, we have to look at the men on the ground, the ones who fought the war with grease and wrenches instead of machine guns. In the sweltering jungle of 1943 New Guinea, the status quo was a brutal grind of attrition. Meet Sergeant McKenna. He is 32 years old, a former auto mechanic from the American Midwest who once spent his days tuning Ford engines and his nights dreaming of the open road. Now his hands are permanently stained with hydraulic fluid and the red clay of Dobodura. He is the lead mechanic for Hayes' squadron, a man who doesn't see assets or serial numbers, but lives. McKenna is a man of few words, but he listens. He listens to the engines, and more importantly, he listens to the pilots. Every evening, as the sun dips below the jungle canopy and the mosquitoes begin their relentless assault, he watches the P-38s limp back to the dirt strip. Some come back with their wings riddled with holes that shouldn't be there. Others don't come back at all. He sees the young ensigns, barely 20 years old, with eyes that look 80, staring at the empty spots in the revetment. They speak of the lag. They tell him the P-38 is a tank, powerful, fast, and armed to the teeth. But it's lazy in a fight. It's like wrestling a bear when you need to be fencing with a rapier. The normal order of things in the U.S. Army Air Forces was built on a foundation of rigid discipline and engineering perfection. The P-38 Lightning was the crown jewel of Lockheed, a technological marvel with its counter-rotating propellers and concentrated firepower in the nose. On paper, it was invincible. In the briefing rooms, the officers spoke of energy tactics and high-altitude dominance. But in the mud of Dobodura, McKenna sensed that this normal order was a lie. He saw the fragility of the entire Pacific campaign hanging by a thread, or more accurately, by a steel cable. He knew the pilots were brave, and he knew the engines were strong, but there was a disconnect, a hidden flaw that the manuals refused to acknowledge. He began to wonder, if the book says the plane is perfect, why are we burying so many of our friends? Is there a point where following the rules becomes a form of negligence? The problem was a technical ghost, a flaw hidden deep within the very nervous system of the P-38. The Lightning's ailerons, the flaps on the wings that control its roll and agility, were operated by a complex system of steel cables. These cables ran from the cockpit yoke, through the fuselage, and out into the long twin booms to the wings. According to the Lockheed engineers back in Burbank and the official Army technical manuals, these cables needed a specific amount of slack. This wasn't a mistake. It was by design. The engineers calculated that as the plane moved through different altitudes and temperatures, the metal of the airframe and the cables would expand and contract. If the cables were too tight, they might snap under the stress of a high-speed dive. If they were too loose, well, the manual said they were within specifications. But McKenna, crawling through the cramped, oil-slicked interior of the P-38's fuselage, realized that this specification was a killer. He spent hours tugging on those cables, watching how they behaved. He saw that when a pilot moved the yoke, the cable didn't move the aileron immediately. Instead, it had to stretch and pull taut, taking up that speck slack before the plane would actually begin to roll. In a laboratory in California, a quarter-second delay was a rounding error. In the vacuum of a dogfight at 300 miles per hour, that quarter-second was the difference between life and death. The consequences were tragic. The Mitsubishi Zero was a masterpiece of lightweight construction. It had no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and no heavy radios. It was built for one thing: maneuverability. A Zero could change direction the moment its pilot thought about it. When an American P-38 tried to follow a Zero into a turn, the lag meant the Zero was already halfway through the maneuver before the lightning even began to bank. The P-38s were being hunted not because they were slower, but because they were numb. They were heavyweight boxers trying to hit a fly with a sledgehammer. McKenna could see the frustration in Robert Hayes's eyes every time he landed. The pilot would describe how he had a Zero in his sights, only for the enemy to slip away during that fraction of a second when the P-38's controls felt like they were mush. The technical reality was a tragedy of engineering. American pilots were dying because their planes were literally too loose to fight back. If the experts wouldn't admit the flaw, could a man with a wrench find a way to fix it? The military hierarchy is a wall of steel, and in 1943, that wall was reinforced with a dogmatic belief in the official way of doing things. The commanders at headquarters in Australia and the brass in Washington didn't want to hear about cable lag. They looked at the charts and saw that the P-38 had more horsepower, more guns, and more speed than anything the Japanese flew. To them, the problem wasn't the machine, it was the tactics. They issued memos telling pilots to avoid turning fights at all costs. Stick to energy tactics, they said. Don't get drawn into a dogfight. But the pilots on the front lines knew that was easier said than done. You can't always dictate the terms of a battle when you're being ambushed from the sun. When a Zero is on your tail, you have to turn, and you have to turn now. The official doctrine ignored the human cost of that cable slack. It ignored the frantic final radio calls of men who tried to roll away from a burst of fire and found their wings unresponsive. To the brass, a P-38 was $1 million investment. To McKenna, it was the only thing standing between Robert Hayes and a watery grave in the Solomon Sea. The manual was the law. Tampering with the flight control system was not just a violation of protocol, it was a court-martial offense. The engineers argued that tightening the cables would lead to structural failure, or control surface binding. They prioritized the theoretical integrity of the airframe over the practical survival of the pilot. But McKenna saw it differently. He saw a safe plane that kept getting shot down because it couldn't move. He saw the disconnect between the sterile offices where the manuals were written and the blood-stained cockpits where they were read. He realized that the standard operating procedure was actually a suicide pact. As he watched another crate of a pilot's personal belongings being hauled away, he felt a cold resolve. How long can you follow the rules when the rules are the reason people are dying? One humid afternoon, the breaking point arrived. Robert Hayes climbed out of his cockpit after a grueling mission over Rabaul. He was physically exhausted, his flight suit soaked with sweat, his hands still trembling from the adrenaline. He didn't scream or throw his helmet. He just walked over to McKenna, looked him in the eye, and pointed at the wings. He didn't have to say it. McKenna knew. The lag had almost cost him everything that day. That night, under the cover of darkness, McKenna made his move. He didn't have a laboratory or a team of assistants. He had a flashlight, a pair of pliers, and a small coil of high-tensile piano wire he had scavenged from a supply crate. He knew he was about to commit an act of high-stakes sabotage, or salvation. He waited until the base was quiet, the only sounds being the distant drone of a night fighter and the chirping of jungle insects. He crawled back into the cramped, hot fuselage of Hayes's P-38. The air inside was stifling, smelling of old oil and trapped heat. He located the main aileron control cables where they passed through the booms. He took a 6-inch length of that piano wire and, with the precision of a jeweler, bent it into a sharp, resilient Z shape. It was a crude piece of improvisational engineering, a gambiarra in the truest sense. He hooked the wire into the cable system, creating a makeshift tensioner. The Z wire acted like a spring, constant and firm. It took up every millimeter of the slack that the manuals insisted was necessary. It was a hidden, silent modification. McKenna climbed into the cockpit and gripped the yoke. He moved it just an inch to the left. Outside in the darkness, the aileron snapped upward instantly. No delay, no mush, no hesitation. The plane felt like a living thing again. He knew the risks. If the wire snapped, or if the cable bound up at high altitude, Hayes might lose control and crash. But he also knew that without it, Hayes was already a dead man walking. He climbed out, wiped the grease from the fuselage, and didn't tell a soul. He had chosen the pilot over the manual. But what would happen when that 6-inch wire was subjected to the violent G-forces of a real dogfight? The next mission was a massive strike against the Japanese airfields at Leh. The air was thick with tension as the P-38s of the 475th Fighter Group taxied down the dirt runway, kicking up clouds of red dust. Robert Hayes pushed his throttles forward, feeling the raw power of the twin Allisons as he climbed into the morning sun. He didn't know about the piano wire. He only knew that he had to survive another day in the meat grinder of the New Guinea skies. Suddenly, the radio erupted. "Zeke's at 10 o'clock high! Break left!" A swarm of Zeros dove out of the glare, their white wings flashing like knives. It was a classic ambush. A Zero lunged at Hayes's wing, the Japanese pilot already leading his shot, expecting the P-38 to make its usual sluggish bank to the right. Automatically, Hayes slammed the yoke over. What happened next defied everything Hayes knew about his aircraft. The P-38 didn't just turn, it snapped. The roll was so violent and so instantaneous that Hayes's head slammed against the side of the canopy. The plane reacted as if it had read his mind. In that moment, the physics of the Pacific War shifted. Within 7 minutes, the sky over Leh became a slaughterhouse for the Japanese. Hayes was no longer fighting his own plane. He was using it as a weapon. He reversed his turn with such speed that the Japanese pilot, who had already committed to his flight path, overshot completely. Hayes found himself perfectly positioned behind the Zero's tail. He squeezed the trigger, and the .450 caliber machine guns and the 20mm cannon in the nose of the P-38 tore the Zero into burning confetti. He didn't stop there. He dove into another engagement, rolling, banking, and diving with a nimbleness that the P-38 shouldn't have possessed. By the time the air cleared, Hayes had downed 3 Zeros in less than 10 minutes. When he landed back at Dobodura, he didn't even wait for the engines to stop spinning before jumping out of the cockpit. He was shouting, his face a mask of disbelief and triumph. "McKenna, I don't know what you did, but she's a different plane. She's alive. She's rolling like a dream." The secret was out. Captain Frank Mitchell, the squadron leader, had watched Hayes's maneuvers from a distance and couldn't believe his eyes. He cornered McKenna behind the hangars. He didn't ask for a briefing or a technical report. He just looked at the mechanic and said, "I want whatever you gave Hayes, and I want it on every plane in my flight." The rebellion had officially become a revolution, but in a world of inspections and regulations, how do you keep a miracle hidden from the people who would call it a crime? The McKenna mod began to spread like a secret gospel among the mechanics of the South Pacific. It was an underground network of grease monkeys and Z-wire specialists. They didn't have formal meetings. They had whispered conversations over oily coffee and late-night sessions in the shadows of the hangars. They called it tuning the nerves of the lightning. The mechanics became masters of deception. They knew that if a general or a tech inspector from the States showed up, they had to be ready. They developed a system where they could remove the Z wire tensioners in less than 60 seconds and reinstall them just as quickly once the suits were gone. They were protecting their pilots from the very organization that was supposed to be supporting them. The results were undeniable. The statistics in the Pacific Theater began to invert. The P-38 Lightning, once considered a heavy and vulnerable interceptor, was becoming the most feared plane in the sky. The Japanese pilots were baffled. They reported to their superiors that the Americans had developed a new type of Lightning, one that could outroll a Zero at high speeds. They couldn't understand how a plane that big could move that fast. The loss-to-kill ratio, which had been a grim 2.1 against the Americans, leveled out to 1.1, and then it began to soar in favor of the U.S. Army Air Forces. Every time a pilot came home with a story of a narrow escape or a surprising kill, McKenna felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. He wasn't in the headlines, and his name wasn't on the nose of any plane, but he was the silent architect of their survival. The Gambiara was winning the war, one 6-inch piece of wire at a time. But as the war progressed and the P-38 became a legend, the truth was bound to come out. What would happen when the designers of the perfect plane realized that a sergeant in the mud had found a way to make it better? Months later, the rumors of this miraculous transformation finally reached the ears of the executive offices at Lockheed and the top-tier engineers in Burbank. They were seeing the combat reports from New Guinea and they couldn't make sense of the data. The roll rates being reported by pilots like Hayes and Mitchell were physically impossible according to their wind tunnel tests and cable specifications. They didn't send the police. They sent a team of technical investigators. They arrived at Dobodura with clipboards and sensors, looking for the magic that had turned the P-38 into a Zero killer. They spent days examining the planes, but the mechanics were always one step ahead, removing the wires before the inspectors could find them. Finally, one of the engineers, a man who truly cared more about the plane than the protocol, pulled McKenna aside. "Look," he said, "we know there's something you're doing. The pilots won't stop talking about it. Just show us. We're not here to get you in trouble. We're here to understand." McKenna hesitated, then he led the engineer to a P-38 and pulled back a maintenance panel. He pointed to the small Z-shaped wire. The engineer stared at it for a long time. It was so simple, so crude, and so effective. He realized that McKenna had solved a problem they hadn't even wanted to admit existed. They ran the tests right there on the strip, measuring the tension and the response time. They had to admit the truth. The within specifications slack was a fundamental design flaw, and the mechanic's improvisational fix was the cure. When the next model of the aircraft, the P-38J, rolled off the assembly lines in California, it featured a revolutionary new hydraulic boost system and a mechanical tensioning device. The slop was officially gone. The P-38J became the definitive version of the plane, the one that would carry legends like Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire to their record-breaking kill counts. But in the glossy brochures and the official history of Lockheed, there was no mention of a sergeant in a malaria-ridden swamp. The upgrade was hailed as a triumph of corporate innovation and advanced engineering. The man who had risked his career to save his friends was left out of the narrative. But does the recognition of the brass matter when you have the gratitude of the men who came home? The war eventually ended, as all wars do. Robert Hayes and Frank Mitchell returned to the United States as heroes, decorated with medals and celebrated in their hometowns. They both lived long, full lives, surviving the conflict because of a split-second advantage they had in the skies over the Pacific. They never forgot the man in the grease-stained overalls who gave them that advantage. Sergeant McKenna, however, didn't ask for a parade. He quietly hung up his uniform and went back to the civilian world he had left behind. He returned to his true passion, mechanics. He spent the rest of his life working on cars in a small town, a humble man who lived a quiet, anonymous life. To his neighbors, he was just the guy who could fix any engine, the one who always had a bit of wire or a spare part to get a neighbor's tractor running again. He died in 2006, a grandfather and a veteran, taking with him the knowledge that he had personally saved the lives of perhaps 100 young men. His Z wire was a small thing, a tiny piece of metal in a massive war machine, but its impact was immeasurable. He was the unsung hero of the fork-tailed devil, a man who saw a problem, defied the rules, and changed the course of aerial history with nothing but a pair of pliers and a heart full of empathy. McKenna's legacy isn't written in bronze or stone. It's written in the lives of the children and grandchildren of the pilots who returned from the Pacific. It's written in the silent history of every P-38 that rolled a fraction of a second faster than its enemy. His story is a testament to the power of the individual, the ingenuity of the worker, and the moral courage it takes to break the rules when those rules are wrong. He reminded us that the most important part of any machine isn't the engine or the wings. It's the person who knows how to make it human. Comment with the word ingenuity if you believe that the men in the mud won the war just as much as the men in the sky. Tell us, have you ever had to find a creative, unauthorized solution to a problem that everyone else said was impossible?